Analyst, I looked at three stories about Christianity in the mainstream news. One talked about Gen Z returning to church, another reported on Donald Trump's positioning of hawkish Christian nationalism as it relates to voting, and another delved into how the phrase Christ is King has been politicized. Together, they show how powerful the media are in defining what Christianity means. The USA Today opinion piece, not just Easter, Gen Z is returning to Christianity, used polling data to say that young men especially are heading back to church, perhaps signaling a religious revival. It told a hopeful story I recognized in my own life, that being the Christian faith as a source of stability and community for a generation anxious about the future. However, the article also defined success in terms of numbers. The main focus became whether Christianity was growing again rather than what kind of Christianity is actually forming in people. I wrote a story from Trump's 2024 presidential campaign, reported on him calling the election a Christian battle while comparing it to D-Day. Christians ended up being framed as a threatened group whose votes could save the nation. The article accurately reported on what Trump said. While he definitely framed his speech to tie Christianity to resentment, nationalism, and partisan combat, the article did not counter that by pointing out Christianity's historic creeds of loving your neighbor and sacrificial service. Finally, an Associated Press article traced how the phrase Christ is King has become a changed slogan in political debates. While it's true that the phrase has become a dog whistle for extremist groups, it is also a basic confession of all Christians. Regardless of politics or nationalism, while this article did attempt balance by quoting Christians who rejected the misuse of or the phrase, one was left with the impression that Christ is King has been hijacked by those flaming the fires of Christian nationalist culture war. Our Age propaganda textbook help explains that what's going on here. Mass media often works less on changing our specific beliefs and more by telling us what to think about what counts as important. Often this does not under the guise of simple reporting the news. This is called pre-persuasion, meaning the media define the terms of the debate before we even start to argue. In the stories, I choose central issue because church growth, political power, and extremes. Christianity becomes a problem to measure, a block of mobilized, or a threat to manage. Propaganda can take many forms according to Prakins. It can look like entertainment, news, simple fact sharing, and emotional engaging stories, whether positive or fear-based. When Christianity shows up in those spaces, it often has the package to lift the medium of the story structure. Church growth turns into a chart about one single group. Politicians use religious languages to energize their base. Stories debate Christ is King as a prayer or a hate speech. In each case, we just get a slice, not the whole pie. Consider the Gen Z story. National surveys from the group like Barna confirm that many young adults are indeed showing renewed interest in Jesus. At the same time, broader research from Pew shows that overall Christian affiliation in the United States has declined over the last 2 decades, and the share of people with no religious affiliation has grown. Put together, the data describes a complex picture. It's not simple, come back to Christianity, it's the complexity I want to tell sounds like this. Christianity in public life is less triumph, return, or some kind of last stand, but instead of an ongoing practicing or learning to love God and neighbor in an ever-changing plastic society. Its story not only about whether or not segment professes newfound faith, but instead about how they listen, repent, learn, and serve. It's also a story about the way of the both paths. Why are people coming back? Why are they leaving? As we answer those questions, we get deeper insights. Now let's look at Trump's rhetoric at his rally. Reporting on his words was important. However, leaving it essentially gives the stage of Christian nationalist way of thinking. Instead of asking whether or not Christianity is winning or losing political power, let's ask what the faith can do with the power it has, and what kind of power it needs to accomplish the goal of living Christian life. Prodicans say that propaganda defines issues in ways that guarantee a win. By refusing to play the game, by centering on Christian outcomes now and in more influential future, that narrative can disrupt the idea that Christianity is nothing but a threat. Centering the narrative of examples of Christian love and service would counteract feeling trapped in a Christian victimhood. The AP coverage of Christ is King shows how historic Christian confession of faith can be hijacked as a partisan slogan. However, when Christians take the phrase as it's meant, it points to the belief that the ultimate authority belongs to Christ, not to the person or persons saying Christ is King. As a counteractive, I would tell the story Christ is King as a call to public humility, and hospitality. While this story would be necessarily include the negative connotations since it's facts that it's used that way, rather than marking who is in our Christ's kingdom, I would include examples of Christian service that's social justice, illustrating that all who come forward will be welcomed, with the goal of attaining a sincere realization of Christ as King. The counter-narrative recognizes the dangers highlighted in the AP piece. It also strongly insists that the counter-narrative is more powerful and ultimately the true narrative. The dominant story about Christianity in public life are not only stories available, but recognizing how media frames the stories and how the medium can shape the message. We can create counter-narratives that do not attack but simply tell a fuller story.